Rigor, let's start now. I am Laurette Dubé, the James McGill Chair of Consumer and Lifestyle Psychology at the Developmental Faculty of Management at McGill, and the founding chair and scientific director of the McGill Center for the Convergence of Health and Economics, which is not only a multidisciplinary, multi-faculty, multi-university center. It is essentially bringing together scientists and what we call action partner in trying to understand better how does our human brain make decisions in real world context and in the moment, in order to understand and characterize the multi-scale mechanism and diversity, but also link this to the other level of multi-scale and diversity that is at play if we are to transform this real world through practice, innovation, and so on. This series is one of 3 series devoted more specifically to understanding of human decision-making and behavior. We have 2 other one more about the AI digital aspects, which is a key enabler to make this happen at this point in time, both in science and action. And a third one that is about what we call convergence innovation. Today, I am extremely pleased to be able to have this anchor session on the self, which everybody knows is a key lifelong bridge between the brain and the world. It's just quite complex in terms of understanding how to study it and how to act upon it in our everyday life. Before I let my colleague Lawrence introduce Georg, and George, I apologize if I have a French accent and not a German one. That's part of the game. I will give you a bit of context for the way we are proceeding very much with advancing this precision convergence science together. We have been for the last 6 months transforming a regular seminar or webinar into an anchor presentation and an extensive and rich panel who all together cover the full spectrum of what we are trying to achieve. Both in a first round, reacting as per, they will introduce themselves and react as they find appropriate to George's presentation. And then in a second round, provide us with how can we all move together, this precision convergence science, whatever we call it. During, as Kitty was saying, during the presentation, typically, unless there is technical problem or burning question, we keep the question for the end with the round from the panel discussion and then open to the digital floor. So I will shift to you, Lawrence, to introduce yourself and our presenter.
Sure. Thank you very much, Laurette. I'm delighted to be able to take part in this meeting today. I'm Lawrence Kermer. I'm the director of the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry here at McGill, which is a program devoted to looking at the impact of culture and social context on mental health. And so our discussions today are absolutely central to these concerns. In fact, I'm very glad to have been able to include Georg's perspectives in a couple of recent edited volumes. So we're very privileged today to have Professor Georg Northoff joining us from the University of Ottawa, where he's Canada Research Chair in Mind, Brain Imaging, and Neuroethics. He's a unique figure in contemporary neuroscience because he comes with a background not only in neuroimaging and neuroscience, but also in philosophy and in psychiatry. So he has a grounding in clinical reality. He has an engagement with the kind of refined critical thinking that we depend on philosophy for. And he has taken this three-legged stool, as it were, and used it to stand on the shoulders of giants and really try to build bridges between very different domains of intellectual work. And we're very excited really to have his perspectives here today. He has authored literally hundreds of articles, 15 books, and the books are characterized by really bold thinking that builds bridges between phenomenology, psychopathology, and the situated brain, as it were, a kind of ecological view of the brain, which he's been advocating for based on a lot of empirical work. So without any further ado, I'm happy to turn the session over to Georg, and thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and the nice introduction. So my talk basically today, I will, let me see. Can you see the, oh, I think I need to shift this one to the side. I need to shift you to the side. I'm sorry about that, but.
We're okay. That doesn't affect our view, and we see your slides. So, and it's great.
Okay, good. So that's perfect. Yeah, you already said my talk will be about the self, clear, and we still, despite all progress in neuroscience, we still suffer from a gap because we have these mental features like a sense of self, an experience of self, and the neuronal activity. And we don't really know the bridges. And my talk tries to offer you one strategy with a lot of empirical data to bridge that gap. And I think that's really key to all brain-mind issues and still an open issue. So, and here you already see from brain to self, and I already put the two key notions forward here, temporal, spatial, and neuro-ecological. And as Lawrence nicely indicated, every progress on the empirical side must go hand in hand with conceptual progress. When you look into physics, biology, you see always both empirical as conceptual progresses. Yeah, go back to Darwin, go back to Einstein, go back to Copernicus, and I think similarly we need hand in hand. So I will present you a lot of empirical data today. However, I will also present you what these data imply, maybe a new conceptual perspective on this issue of brain and mind, with the two key features here, I say, brain and self, with the two key features, temporal, spatial, neuro-ecological. So let me put some flesh to the bones. My talk will have three parts. First, I will show you self and the brain's spontaneous activity, which might look difficult for you because you think the self is a higher order cognitive function, should be related with cognitive activity, task states. However, I show you some data that the self is already deeply encoded into spontaneous activity. Second, as you all know, the brain has a body and an environment. And if the self is related to the spontaneous activity, you must say it is related to body environment. So I show you some data in this respect. Third part, which is probably the most interesting part, because I think it's the key notion in your case, how does our self modulate reward and decision making? Yeah. So I will start with the first part of my talk, self and the brain's spontaneous activity. So what is the self? Self, I'm sure you went to the mirror this morning and you saw yourself and you didn't even think about it. You took it for granted. You said, it's my face, it's me. Then maybe your partner called your name. Yes, it's me, and you reacted fast. And all by default, all automatic, completely unconscious, no voluntary. Yeah, because it's just your default. And that's very important. It's a deeper level where you're not aware. Why do I mention that? Because from philosophy, we usually associate the self with awareness and consciousness. Self is almost used identical with self-consciousness in philosophy. Maybe there's a deeper dimension to the self. And important, again, that's where my background in psychiatry comes in. I have seen quite a number of famous people in my psychiatric life. I have seen Jesus, I have Buddha, I have seen Buddha, I have seen Nefertiti, Mao, and other famous people. People who think and are certain, and that's important, the subjective certainty that they are somebody else. They dress, they act like that. Interestingly, and I'm sure Lawrence knows this much better than I do, there is a lot of cultural dependence. You meet a Mao in China, but you don't meet a schizophrenic patient who thinks she or he is Mao in Germany. Yeah, so there I'd rather meet Jesus. So it's very interesting. There's a cultural context dependence about, again, which lets you deeply think about how the brain must function in order to bring forward something like that. So this means the self is an active construction process by the brain. It's not a given because it can go wrong. So in 2006, we said, okay, maybe the neural correlates of the self, the certain structures in the brain, in the middle of the brain, cortical midline structures are key. And interestingly, and we did this meta-analysis, and then interestingly, at the time, we already said maybe these seem to strongly overlap with the default mode network regions, which show high resting state activity, which Reckler published in 2001. And in 2004, in another paper in Ticks, we said maybe yourself is the psychological baseline, analogous to what he said, physiological baseline. Yeah. So in the baseline should be involved in everything, and literally basis and fundamental. So then we said, okay, maybe there's an overlap between the resting state activity and your self-related activity. And that's exactly what we did in another study, 2011, and has been confirmed by others since in our own data, others' data, that there's strong overlap between high resting state activity and self-specific activity. And that, again, you see this here, happens exactly in the cortical midline structures, perigenial anterior cingulate cortex, posterior cingulate cortex. So that raises the question, what? So that means if there seems to be an overlap of the spontaneous activity and self-specific activity. So that looked to me rather paradoxical at the time, because usually you associate the self with higher order cognitive activity as measured in task states, but not in spontaneous activity. So then, of course, the question is, what are the features in the brain spontaneous activity that mediate the sense of self? Yeah, because there's no explicit task states going on. So then we said, okay, the brain spontaneous activity, there's a lot of functional connectivity network going on, but there's also certain dynamics going on. And what I mean by dynamics is change from time point to time point, and that in these changes from time point to time point, there's a certain structure. And I will go into some of these features of these structures. So let's say, look to the seaside. You see on the left, powerful waves. They're not that often, but slow waves, but extremely powerful. On the right, you see slower waves. They're much more often of faster waves on the right. Literally, they're faster and less powerful. So there's a certain structure. And that is also similar things you can see in the time series of your brain. So here, the typical time series can be obtained in fMRI, could be obtained in EEG, MEG. So this looks completely random. It's not. Because there's a certain structure, there are different frequencies. We all know this as gamma, beta, alpha, infraslow frequencies, which you can measure. And importantly, these different frequencies have a certain power structure. You can see this here on the left. When you plot the frequency on the Y, on the x-axis, power on the y-axis, you see that the slower frequencies have much faster power than the faster frequencies, more on the right. So there's a certain structure in the power spectrum, power spectral density. And you can measure that in fMRI in the very infraslow range. This is 0.01 Hertz to 0.1 Hertz, is 100 seconds to 10 seconds, or in the faster range of EEG, 1 second, and then into the millisecond range. And that's what we do, because we just want to see how much are these different frequencies related to each other. And maybe, that's important, maybe that relationship in the power spectral density, as people say, encodes your sense of self. So that's a bold hypothesis, but how can you approach it? Because you don't have task states. So you link the resting state activity power spectral density to your degrees of self-consciousness. Then, of course, the question comes up, how do you want to measure self-consciousness if not in task-related activity? So one way is here the following study, what we did here. 2016 in FMI, we applied a psychological scale for self-consciousness scale, which has 3 dimensions, private, public, social. And then we correlated the inter-individual differences in that scale with the inter-individual differences in the power spectrum in the brain's resting state. And you can measure the brain's power spectrum, the shape of the curves, the steepness of the curves by what is called the power law exponent. Here you see, for instance, I show you, just it's quite impressive. So this is the power spectrum. You see here the frequency. Here you see the power. And you see the slower frequencies have much higher power than the faster frequencies. And each of these curves is one subject. You see huge differences, inter-individual differences. And these are not artifacts. This is proper pre-processing in fMRI and everything. So this is real. This is huge inter-individual differences in the shape of the curves. And then you see for the posterior cingulate cortex, here again, each line is one subject. And you see again these inter-individual differences. And also you see a difference in the shape of the power spectrum between the 2 regions. So each region has its, as we can say, its intrinsic time scale. Yeah, one region, some regions are a little bit slower, other regions are more faster, for instance, sensory regions, because they need to process the input. So you have an intrinsic time scale, and the relation between this intrinsic time scale seem to be strongly related to your sense of self. Because what we could see here on the right, you could see here, this is particularly the private self-consciousness score of our self-consciousness scale. And here on the y-axis, you can see the power law exponent, meaning the steepness of this curve. Meaning the higher your power law exponent, the steeper the curve, the more power you have in the slow frequencies. So if you have strong, powerful waves in your brain's fluctuations, you have a higher degree of private self-consciousness. So it's basically, I think this wave example is always good. Then we say, okay, this is only in the infra-slow frequency range, 0.01 Hertz to 0.1 Hertz. How about the EEG frequencies, the faster frequency from 1 Hertz to 50 Hertz? So then we did similar things in EEG. Again, it's a different subject sample. Again, self-consciousness scale, and measure the resting state in EEG. You see here the typical power spectrum in EEG. So this is all log-log on both frequency and power from 1 to 50. And no, sorry, 40. And you see also certain steepness of the curves. This is a typical alpha peak around 8 to 13 Hertz. So this is typical. But what is important that the shape of this power spectrum again correlated with the private self-consciousness, meaning the more power, the steeper the curve, the more power you have in the slower frequencies, the higher your private self-consciousness. So that sort of linked us to the idea, and I was very excited about these findings at the time, because maybe it's the structure of your power spectrum that really links to your degree of self-consciousness. And I emphasize structure here, because we also try to correlate just the pure power of the frequencies that didn't correlate. So it's really the shape, the structure. And for those who are, that might be related to our sense of self. And as I said, it's philosophically, it's an interesting philosophical connotation here, because structure relates strongly to form, and that has a long tradition in German idealism, Immanuel Kant, who considered the self also informal in terms of form and structure, rather than specific contents, rather than specific cognitive contents. So then you say, yeah, this is just resting state, but do we really know that it is related to the self? It's just correlation. Yeah, is it really behaviorally relevant for us? And that, of course, always the question with the resting state is a methodological issue. So one way to tackle that is, let's say, okay, look whether the same measures in EEG and fMRI resting state are altered in psychotic conditions where you have a disturbance of your sense of self. And that is indeed prototypical examples are schizophrenia and autism. And schizophrenia, it's well known, phenomenologists like Panas, with whom we actually collaborated on this paper, speak of a basic disturbance of self in schizophrenia. Yeah, it's a phenotypic trait marker. And the disturbance of self can, for instance, be manifested in what I said earlier, that you feel, that you experience yourself as a different person. Yeah, or that you have the feeling when I talk now that I put some thoughts into your mind and that the thoughts you're thinking are not your thoughts, are my thoughts. Yeah, or maybe when you hear my noise, this is my voice, this is not an hallucination, just for your information, I'm indeed talking. So, so we investigated the same measures and some other measures of intrinsic timescales like the autocorrelation window in schizophrenia. And indeed, we found a disturbance in these, in the power law spectrum, particularly interesting, it didn't react to self-specific paradigm, a task. So we did the rest task difference and it didn't react to that in the schizophrenia. So there was no difference between the paradigm as a self paradigm and the non-self paradigm in schizophrenia. So it seems that maybe the power law exponent can no longer really encode self-specific information as in healthy subject. In autism, we did an fMRI study. So if schizophrenia was EEG, autism, we did an fMRI study. And interestingly, we found an increased power law exponent, meaning these autistic people may have too much power in their slow frequencies, particularly in the silence network. Yeah, and then we related that also to sense of self. So indeed, there seems to be some indirect evidence, but of course, you want more direct evidence, and I will present you another study, but before I want to make a little conceptual detour here. So how do we imagine these temporal dynamical features of the resting state to be related to the self? So for instance, here we measure power law exponent. You saw already these curves. And what this is really a nestedness. It's like, you will see this a lot. I like this comparison very much. Nestedness, like the Russian dolls, one smaller is nested within the other. And that means it's the same shape, but different sizes. That is what you call scale free. The same shape operates across different spatial scales in the Russian doll. Same here in the brain. Yeah, this is indicated by this little figure. And Anne-Marie Wolf, who conducted the study, postdoc in my group now, she did this very nice figure. And maybe it's analogous nestedness on the side of the self. Because yourself is operative on very short time scales and in longer time scales, over years, as well as in the millisecond. Yeah, you hear your name and you react. So it seems to be present like the same shape across different time scales, and probably for space that applies to. Then we had some other measures. Just I just want to mention that here is the autocorrelation window, typical intrinsic time scales, also correlated with the sense of self, and cross-frequency coupling modulated by the modulation index measured. But now, however, you say, yeah, this is just a resting state. But how do we know that the temporal features in the resting state do really impact corresponding temporal features on the psychological level? That's what you want to know. Because if you say it's really the temporal dynamic features of the resting state that impacts the self, then it may impact the temporal structuring of the self on the psychological level. Yeah, so meaning, so, and that's what we tested in this study. So here we again measured the brain resting state. But then we also did a complex psychological task rather than just a scale. We had the shape label task by Zui, wonderful task. And I tell you what we did here. So here, when you see the upper part, you have to associate a certain shape with a label. So the shape can be a triangle, it can be a square or whatever, a quadrant. And you can associate that, that is my cursor is disappearing here, here it is, with a label, and that label can be either you, another person, a friend, or whatever, yeah? And interestingly, you have a higher accuracy and a better reaction time when you have to associate the label with your own name. This is what is called the self-bias. Yourself is very powerful, as we all know, and it's amazing. Even in a little test, you have a better reaction time, higher accuracy. If you then you learn this in a training session, and then they present you the shapes with a different name, with the different labels, and you have a better faster reaction time, higher accuracy for those where you associate with yourself. So, and what we did, we inserted a temporal delay into that. So we presented the shape, but the label later. And then we wanted to see whether the self-bias is still preserved through these different temporal delays. So this was 40, 120, 700 milliseconds. So and why is temporal delay? Because we say maybe if your self really operates across different time scales and shows temporal less scale free on the neuronal level, as we showed, then it should also be manifest on the psychological level. And that's exactly what we did. So we saw, you can see here the different delays. Yeah, and across all delays, maybe here the last one wasn't, you still have the self-bias. So you have the superiority of the self across the delay is preserved. And you can see this here, the accuracy, it's well preserved across these different time delays. Yeah. Yeah, and excuse me, I just need to respond to this. I'm in the middle of my talk until 1. And okay, so you see the accuracy over the different delays. The accuracy is preserved. Yeah, and you see the difference between the self, non-self. Yeah, so that's a clear difference. So that means your self-bias, your efficiency of the self, seems to be preserved across the temporal delays. Okay, now of course you say maybe this is just a working memory effect. Yeah, we controlled for working memory, you see this here, and also for learning effects. Okay, so then we said, okay, we looked for the same subject. We had them in resting state EEG, and we correlated that now again with our midline regions. And we here again measured the autocorrelation window and the power law exponent, the shape of the power spectrum. And we correlated that with the slope of this curve here. Yeah. There were some individual variations. And we again see, okay, the higher your power law exponent, the steeper and the better your self-bias was preserved for the longer time intervals. So meaning if you have more power in the slower frequencies, you have higher power law exponent, meaning you're better to cope with these delays, also with the longer delays. So that's sort of an indication for us that maybe the temporal structure on the neuronal level is related to the temporal structure on the psychological level. Yeah. So because this is what we tested here, we tested these delays and indeed could relate them. There's another monkey study by Mari et al. 2014 Nature Neuroscience who showed that the reward delay, how much you can delay reward and the temporal discounting task is also related to the length of the autocorrelation. And importantly, this was not related to working memory or learning effects because we covariate for that. Yeah? So that really seems to be a temporal dynamic mechanism which bridges the gap from the neuronal to the psychological level. So very tentatively, this led us on the conceptual level to say maybe temporal spatial dynamics are shared between neuronal and mental features. They provide a bridge. There's a similarity. They make possible the transformation of neuronal into mental features. Like if you have a longer autocorrelation window, you can better deal with psychological delays in the shape label task. Yeah, and that led us to this, what we call the common currency concept. Is basically that there's a shared features between neuronal and mental activity. And that's what we call common currency. Is like exactly like a shared, let's say US dollar is the currency of the world. You can trade everything everywhere with it. So that's sort of the idea, and here specific for the self, and I think what our brain does with this temporal spatial dynamic. And I love this painting, of course, obviously, you know, it's in Milano, The Last Supper by Da Vinci. And look at this room. You have the feeling this is a static 2D canvas, but you have the feeling it's a 3D canvas and the people are in motion. If you, let's say, had 1 millisecond later, all these apostles would show a different gesturing and differing posture. So what he creates here, it's a virtual 3D dynamic, yeah, in time and space. And that, I would say, is analogous to what our brain does. What the spontaneous activity does is create a virtual 3D spontaneous dynamic, which then we experience in terms of mental features. Yeah, in terms of, for instance, what Husserl called inner time consciousness. Yeah, protension, retention. Yeah, so the probably the power law exponent also related to that we can connect the different tones of a music piece and perceive it as a melody. Yeah. So that goes back. So I hope I could indicate, and this is obviously, as you can see, work in progress, that we now try to have this same temporal spatial dynamical measures also on the psychological. Second part, the brain is not isolated and the self is not isolated, as we know, it's strongly embodied and also embedded and cultured. And I want to show you a couple of studies on that, and that the spontaneous activity is not as much inside in the brain as we always think it to be. Yeah, so this is for those who are in neuroscience, Busaki's inside out view. So here, present you a study published last year, where we presented animate versus inanimate touch. So we had a person with a real hand and a robot hand. And just touching outside the scanner, so it's an explicitly social task. And this was done by Andrea Scalabrini, one of my postdoctoral students in Italy. And he said, okay, he's also very interesting. He's a neuroscientist as well as a psychotherapist. He still runs a practice, which is very nice. So for him, this inanimate touch, because the idea was he had several patients who could not make a difference anymore. They felt completely inanimate. So that's why I wanted to test that. And that's what we did. And we said, yeah, if that makes a difference, it should also be related again to the spontaneous activity dynamics. So first thing what he did, that was very nice. So we presented animate versus inanimate stimuli. We did a psychological study. I show you that. And we did fMRI, rest and task. Okay, next slide. So here I present you the psychological study, which was very interesting. So what he did, it's this one. Yeah. So he did with 100 subjects psychological questionnaire where he asked the touch, remember the animate, inanimate, real person, computer hand, for similarity. So the subjective perception, purely subjective on a visual analog scale, for how similar is the other hand to your own hand and to yourself. So pure proximity of self to other. purely psychological, purely perceived, with a real phenomenological approach, first person. And then he also did, because we were interested in the time and space, he also said, yeah, how much are we temporally in synchrony? How much is the external hand in temporal synchrony with my own self? Again, purely phenomenological, subjective perception. And then the same for spatial closeness. How close do I feel spatially? So this is pure subjective time and space. This is really phenomenology. So, and what he found interesting, and I was really surprised by the findings themselves. So between animate and inanimate target, he felt a much higher closeness to the own self of the animate target, of the real hand. Then perception of time, synchrony. How much is the external, the other hand, out of animate, inanimate, in synchrony with my own time? You see much more synchrony between animate target and own self time than the inanimate. And perception of space, how close do I feel? Yeah, very important. And I'm sure this perception of space and also time, now with all the Zoom stuff, I'm sure radically changes our own boundaries, including our spontaneous activity. Yeah. So just the fact that I cannot synchronize with you now, and you see I'm standing to make at least some movements, yeah, because usually I walk around a lot, and to create some time and space connection between us, yeah, which is very different in the anime. So I was really surprised by these findings, and it really supported the idea, maybe a very basic fundamental feature of ourself is really the time-spatial organization. And I don't need to tell you philosophically, that goes back to Kant and phenomenology. So now the neuronal side of things, or then we also correlated that, I probably leave that out. And conclusion is here, where's the difference coming from animated time, inanimate? It really seems that maybe the scale-free stochastics of your environment is linked to the stochastics of your brain and your perception. So now let me do, then we did the same paradigm in rest and task. So now we combine both rest and task, which is very important. You see here upper left, the difference, and I point out here, a key region, of course, medial prefrontal cortex was significantly higher activated animate versus inanimate. And that, of course, speaks strongly, that's really for the self, because this region is strongly related to the sense of self. Then we went back, had also the resting state, and we did the power law exponent in the resting state. So this is the power spectrum frequency, 0.01 Hertz to 0.1 Hertz. You see more power in the slower frequency, typical curve. You see here the inter-individual differences again. Yeah, also quite amazing again. And you see, interesting, this was very important for us here, that your resting state power law exponent predicted your difference between animate and animate difference in the task. So here you see a rest task prediction. Let's really that your the higher your resting state PLE, meaning the more power in the slow frequencies, the better it can distinguish during the task animate inanimate context. So again, that really supports the view that your resting state power spectrum, your slow waves are instrumental also doing task-related activity in better distinguishing animate, inanimate / self, non-self. Yeah. So further support for the potential behavioral and psychological relevance of this power law scale-free activity in the spontaneous activity. And that's one bridge to the social. Here I show you another study which we did. Again, that was an earlier study where we did fMRI resting state. Again, you see everything focuses on the resting state in my life, except my own probably. Otherwise, I could not get this done. Is our temporal dynamics of the brain spontaneous activity experience dependent? Yeah, meaning is it related to early traumatic childhood experiences. So what we did here is we scanned adult people 20 to 30, 20 to 40, and had also the childhood traumatic questionnaire, CTQ, a well-validated, well-replicated instrument for the acquisition of recording of early traumatic life experience, like I was beaten by my parents, I was abused, different subdimensions, emotional, physical. And to our surprise, just maybe look here on the right, we found that higher levels of the childhood traumatic questionnaire, meaning more early traumatic life experience, led 20 years later to higher degrees of entropy, again in our medial prefrontal cortex. Entropy measures the organization, the disorganization of the neuronal signal. Yeah, so again, it suggests that the spontaneous activities dynamics is highly adaptive, is highly malleable to the context. We recently had a paper on dissociation and post-traumatic stress disorder, where we can show similar finding. So meaning your spontaneous activity is sort of a long-term dynamic memory of its respective context. And that's, of course, we're currently working more on this, really to try to figure out that. Meaning your spontaneous activity is not just inside the brain. It's a long-term adaptive mechanism, yet unclear, where the dynamics is shaped by the respective context. For instance, the cultural context, as I presented 2 weeks ago, or life events, as shown here. Then the question is, what is the relation between traumatic childhood trauma and time? So if traumatic childhood trauma has an impact on the temporal structure of your brain, then you may assume that your childhood trauma may have also an impact on your time perception. And that is then manifest on the neuronal side of things. So this is what we tested in this study. This is a purely psychological study, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. So here we tested in depressive patients, major depressive disorder. And it is known that these patients have a too slow time experience and too negative time experience. So what we did here, we tested them with the CTQ, the Childhood Traumatic Questionnaire. And you see here in the upper right, here's my cursor back. You see a significant higher incidence of early traumatic life events in a major depressive disorder patients, which is well known, replicates previous findings. Then we also did a measure of time perspective, psychological time perspective, the Zimbardo time perspective inventory. And again, as not a surprise that the depression patient showed significantly higher negative past events experience and less future and present. And then the idea is, how is now your early traumatic life events, how are they related to the time perspectives, the Zimbardo, and the depressive symptom? You can have two models. The traditional model would what I'll probably say here on the right. You have childhood trauma that leads to depression, and that changes your time perspective. Interestingly, it was so this, we conducted mediation model. This gave only a partial mediation. This gave a full mediation. Here we put time perspective as a median childhood trauma and depressive symptoms. So then, and that gave us a full mediation. So then we also had some of these, the half of these patients, 50 of these patients, were also treated with dorsolateral prefrontal TMS. That relieved the depressive symptoms, but it did not relieve the time perspective changes, which remains the same before and after. So meaning this is indeed a phenotypic trait marker. This is a state marker. And this seems to be strongly affected by this one. Yeah. So, and we had also some patients who had no depressive symptoms, but traumatic life events and abnormal time perspective. Yeah. So there seems to be two mechanisms going on. First, the childhood trauma leading to abnormal time perspectives. And second, that time perspective, then if you have a predisposition leading to depressive symptoms. So it's not the same. So that again, for me, now on the psychological level, tells me maybe your temporal features now here on the psychological level are key in mediating environmental impact on your brain / your depression. That's of course a tentative hypothesis. Yeah. Brief conceptual slide is of course all work in progress, as you can see. Why is this scale freeness? I showed you several lines of findings with power exponent scale free activity in the brain linked to the self. You remember the fMRI study to self-consciousness, EEG self-consciousness, the delay study, even there the scale free activity was related to the psychological delays in the self-bias. And then I showed you the inanimate studies. And we have further stuff published in the pipeline. So why is the scale-free activity so relevant? Because scale-freeness is ubiquitous in the world. Seismic earthwave shows scale-free. I showed you the Russian dolls, the stock market, music, language are all scale-free. Yeah. So that really seems to be a basic structure in our brain too. Our brain is after all part of nature. That's what I want to indicate here. So you have scale freeness in the ecological social world, power law exponent, time and space perception. Now we're running a lot of psychological experiments with long time series where we apply to scale free features. So that may be a link of our brain to the world, to its context. It provides sort of a dynamic bridge. Yeah, a common currency, as I like to say, then not only between brain and mind or brain and self, but also between brain and the world. Yeah, that this dynamics provides basically a bridge in exactly the way I try to indicate here. Those three. Third part of my talk. So I showed you self is not just related to higher order task activity, but also already encoded self-specific information in your spontaneous activity. Second, I showed you that that spontaneous activity is malleable, is adaptive. Yeah, I showed you the animate, inanimate. I showed you the early traumatic life experience. And I also showed you the psychological studies that time perception is maybe key in mediating between early traumatic life events and depressive symptoms. So now you say, how does that affect our reward and decision-making? There's another line of studies, and I showed you in my third part, I show you some recent studies on that. So the first thing we early on did, this was I think 12 years ago, by now we published this, we did a study, how is the self related to reward? Because obviously self, there's a value function in there, and maybe is that related to reward. And that's what we did, and we particularly focus here on the overlap between neural regions activated in reward and regions activated during self-specificity. So our paradigm was accordingly, so we did a typical reward task here with the gambling. So wherever in time zone you are, I hope you're not hungry, then you don't want to see this cake. And so you had to basically gamble here, typical reward task, and you see this, and then you had the same stimulus with regard to self-specificity. Yeah, that's in the middle, and then again the same stimulus with a simple control task, just the color. Yeah, and then you got feedback. Here you gained something. Here it's just self-specificity, and here is the color. Yeah, and you see the structure of the paradigm is really identical. It's 2 seconds and so on. Pictures are identical, just the decisions. So that really made it possible to first look for those regions which are activated in reward, and then see what happens in those regions during self-specificity. And you know and so we used reward as a functional localizer, and then see what happens in those regions during self. typical reward regions, I don't need to tell you. Let me just show here is, of course, the ventral striatum, right nucleus accumbens. And you see here the difference. You see the reward, win versus lose. That's a typical with some activity. And interestingly, and though it's a subcortical region, this is already here, self-high versus low. You see a very nice distinction. Same here on the left side. You see the distinction win-lose, self-high. Note that the curves are slightly different, but it's always difficult with the temporal delay of the bold signal to make much out of these time course differences. Same here, even more subcortical, the right ventral tegmental area. So this is deep down here. And you again see win-lose expected. This is dopamine, obviously, yeah, D10. But also a difference between self-high and self-low. And here, ventral medial prefrontal cortex, of course, you see a difference in reward. And it's down here, up, here's the cursor. And you see also in self-high versus self-low. So that at the time was a real surprise to us, because usually you associated the self with cortical regions, higher order cortical system. You would have not expected that the self was already encoded in subcortical regions. We did similar studies, self and emotions, and again, we found a lot of subcortical regions. So that means that maybe our self is not just a higher order cortical function, but already deeply as a basis function, which may already be present, encoded self-specificity in subcortical regions. Implicated, for instance, in reward in this paper 2011. And we suggested different models of the relationship between reward and self. You can see this down here. And also we suggested it may be just a matter of timing. So the longer your value or your affect stays, the more likely it may be associated with self-awareness. Yeah. So it may be just a matter of timing, and indeed some a recent study, a psychological study, confirmed that it's sort of more like this model, Jankowskaja et al., and there was another fMRI study in SCAN, I think 2017, which highlighted, also probed this model with respect to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So the point I want to make here is that maybe our self is not just a higher order cognitive function, and it is often conveyed from philosophy. It's a very basic function, and maybe it's already present in other animals, which we pointed out here, which I wrote with Jaak Panksepp 2008. So we suggested a transspecies concept of self, and really the subcortical cortical midline system, which is basically the limbic system. Yeah, when you look at those regions, the cortical midline structures are an extension of the subcortical limbic system onto the cortical level. Yeah. So now the question is, how does our self affect decision making? So here is a line of study which is with a former postdoc of mine from Japan, Takashi Nakao. He is now a professor in Sapporo. He's a very clever guy. So he came to me into my group, and he already studied decision making. And at the time, I had no idea about decision making. And it took me 2 years to understand why he wanted to come to my group, because I was doing self, not decision making. So finally he said, yes, he's interested in the subjective component of decision making. So then we conceptualize that in terms of internally versus externally guided decision making. What do we mean by externally, internally guided? So externally guided is when you have a clear criterion, external criterion, like you go to the supermarket, let's say you buy the same product, I don't know, whatever you want to buy, as let's say you buy some honey, and you have the same honey product, everything is the same, one costs $8 and the other one $10. So you have a clear criterion which one to take. Yeah. That's an externally guided decision making. So the environment gives you some cues, some external cues for how to make the decision, makes it easier for you. However, life is not always as we want it. Sometimes there's uncertainty, we don't know. So then we need to have some internal criteria. So we have value preferences. Yeah, maybe I like the red sign on the $10 honey better than on the $8 on the 2 honeys. So both honeys would be $10. So which one shall I take now? So maybe I should, I love red colors. Oh, and the other one, the one has a beautiful red decoration, the other one. Okay. Yeah, so the internal preferences. So here, so subjective preferences in decision making. So then we did a meta-analysis. He did a meta-analysis of all studies which use more externally guided decision making, which is a majority of all the studies in decision making, and the few studies which use internally guided decision making. And interestingly, then when he compared those studies, so he compared the internally guided, showed activity larger than the externally guided. Interestingly, what showed up the cortical midline structures. These were exactly the same regions we had implicated in the cell. So then I started to understand why he wanted to come to my lab, because he wanted to study the relationship of the self with the decision making. Yeah. So after this result, really my door was open. It's never too late, as we said later. And the externally guided, you see it's more lateral regions. You see the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, of course. You see the thalamus, standard regions. Yeah. So then he said, okay, then he went into EEG. This is, by the way, from Italy. It's in Milano. In the train station, you see the self bar. So I had to do this since I do all this self-research. And okay, then we did said, okay, if this is internally guided, and then we would expect that the internally guided decision-making is related to the resting state. Why? Because we, at that time, we already, this was 2012, we already had findings that say the self is related to the resting state. If internally guided decision-making is related to the self, it should be predicted by the resting state. And that's exactly what he showed in this study. So here he did a task for internal preference. So basically he presented 2 occupations like lawyer or designer, same pay, everything the same. And you just have to decide what is your personal preference. And then the same, which occupation is highly paid or some other objective external criteria. So, and these are the event-related potentials. And then what he did, you see some differences here in the N400, also in the N200. And then he did these potentials, how much they were predicted by the resting state. Yeah, and he calculated the frequency, the power of the different frequencies. So these are the different frequencies, gamma, beta, alpha, theta, and delta. This is the power. And here, and then he see whether the N2 and the 4 and 4 were predicted by the resting state power, whether task-related activity is doing internally and externally decision-making is differentially predicted by the resting state power in the different frequencies. And that's exactly what he did. So here is the externally guided task-related activity, N2 and 4, and the internally guided task-related activity, N2 and 4. And what he showed, and that what you can see here, that the task-related activity only during the internally guided decision-making was predicted by the resting state power in the different frequency band, but not by the externally guided. So this is very interesting. You had minor differences here in the task, but apparently one is related to the resting state, meaning your resting state impacts task-related activity when there is no external criteria. Then it steps in and provides an internal criterion, and that, of course, probably is the self. Yeah, the values associated with yourself. Yeah, your subjective preferences. Yeah, whereas if there's an external criterion, okay, we just go with the external criterion because the brain is like us, it's lazy. Why shall I get involved? Yeah. Good. So that's basically here's the idea. So you see here's the N2 conflict response negativity, and you see it's basically either the brain intrinsic activity kicks only in when there's no external criteria. Yeah. So, and that's basically, you have a balance between internally, externally guided decision-making. So then he did subsequent studies. Another student of mine, Anne-Marie Wolf, whom you encountered earlier with the self, did some very nice studies also on moral decision-making, again, relating it to complexity. Then I want to show you one last study on this, which is very relevant. So, because that now you may ask the question, yeah, Georg, how is the internally guided decision-making now related to the scale-free activity? You showed the scale-free activity, power law exponent related to the self. How is that now related to specifically internally guided decision-making and its psychological manifestation? So here he did a very nice thing. He linked really, as we titled the paper, neuronal and psychological noise. So let me tell you a little bit. So on the psychological side, you can have a certain preference, a certain consistency in your decision-making. So you can calculate the probability density, how often you make the same decision, whether there's a certain consistency in your subjective preferences, meaning your subjective preferences can be more consistent and less consistent over time. Let me just show you another curve here. This is the end of the slide here. Here in this one, when you look down here, they're very less consistent because they have a low probability density, your subjective decision. Yeah. Whereas here, you have a very consistent preference across different decision-making trials. So, and basically that you can say, okay, there's a certain noise. In this case, I have low noise because I'm very consistent. If my curve is very flat, I have a lot of psychological noise in my decision-making, meaning I'm inconsistent. Yeah, and he calculated that basically as a measure of psychological noise, your decision consistency. Yeah, so, and then that was on the psychological level. Then he did on the electrophysiological level, calculated EEG, again, rest and task. And he particularly calculated the scale-free activity in the alpha band, because we know that the alpha band is key for decision-making. And what he observed is that the scale-free activity in his alpha band, calculated here by the detrended fluctuation analysis, which measures the fluctuations in your oscillations, that directly predicted your decision consistency / your psychological noise. So the and that hold again only for internally decision making. So your resting state activity, your scale-free activity in the alpha band in rest only predicted the decision consistency for internally guided decision making. Here, let me get my cursor back, but not in the externally guided decision making. Yeah, and so these are the relevant graphs. Then he also showed that task-related differences were again related between internal and externally guided decision making. Task-related differences. Here, the CRN conflict-related negativity N2 were again related to the scale-free activity in resting state, but only in the internally guided decision-making. So, summary of that study. When you have a low scale-free activity, meaning a lot of neuronal noise in your resting state, like here, you have lower scale-free activity and you have less, consistency in your internally guided decision-making. So you're subjectively less consistent. If in contrast, you have a high scale-free activity with low neuronal noise, here, you have high scale-free activity and you have a more consistent decision-making. So I think it's a beautiful example how, let's say, neuronal consistency or neuronal noise is related to psychological noise, psychological consistency. So that again suggests, because this is a temporal spatial feature, this is really the bridge. Yeah, that's the common currency that your temporal dynamics mediate between the neuronal level and the psychological level. Yeah, so that's basically what we say here. This is the common currency. Consistency in your decision making is mediated by the consistency of your brain's wave. Yeah, so basically saying there's a consistent, and that's what the surfer looks for. The surfer looks for consistent slow waves so that she or he can surf there. Yeah, and the better she or he can adapt. So that's basically another line where temporal spatial dynamics, here scale-free activity, is key for internally decision making and the link between neuronal and psychological levels. So I conclude my talk with a couple of slides just on the conceptual side. What does it mean? What do these findings mean for our concept of self? And as you see that some of my analysis strategy and also the experimental paradigm might be a little bit unorthodox for you who come from the cognitive side. You wouldn't analyze sometimes the data, even the task activity, you wouldn't analyze with scale-free activity, you would just analyze the amplitude. Why do we do that? Because we have a different model of self. So that's where you see how important is the kind of models you have that they directly impact your experimental strategy. So this is a paper I published 2016, where I said, and that was really inspired by these findings that the brain spontaneous activity seems to encode self-specific information. Because that was for me, let's say from a philosophical point of view, a breakthrough finding, because that means that your spontaneous activity is intrinsically subjective if it encodes self-specific information. And that we say then maybe it's not a higher order cognitive function, but it's really a basis function. That's what we discuss here in this basis model of self-specificity. And let me walk you through this graph here. So I said there's continuous input from body and environment. Somehow your brain seems to sort and process that input in a highly individualistic, self-specific way. How that works, I don't know. I like to speak here of self-related processing, because the interoceptive stimuli, exteroceptive stimuli from body and environment are somehow related to your ongoing spontaneous activity / its self-specific information. Yeah, and that's a key process. So the self is an active construction process, and that input process is completely unclear to me here what happens. So this is something that's on our list. We're working on these things, but I cannot say. So this is self-related, and that establishes self-specificity. On a more conceptual level, I would say that this is probably a very pre-subjective, non-personal level. It's pure relation. This is where your relation between your spontaneous activity / self and the environment happen. This is where you have the early life events I showed you. This is where it comes from. That's why the subjects have no access to this. It's completely by default automatic. There's no voluntary control over these kind of processes. And that I would say is encoded in terms of spatial temporal schemata. Yeah, here I try to show that different networks, different frequencies, and that self-specificity, with that you encounter the single stimuli. So that affects your cognitive, your affective function. That's why all your cognition, your affect is to a certain degree on a continuum less or more self-specific. You cannot avoid the basic, as I would say here, subjectivity. If you have more on the conceptual level, I already indicated this is pre-subjective, as I like to say, and probably also pre-objective. Yeah.
2 minutes, Georg, to finish.
Yeah, I'm just one more slide or two slides. Okay. Yeah, here you see the self-relatedness, and here you might call this self-referential processing. Good. Then we had a recent paper, which I want to mention that, where we distinguish between figure and background. And what we call here the background is probably what my talk today was mostly about. What is in there in the resting state that it provides a continuous background for yourself? Yeah, that is where the spatial temporal schemata scale-free activity, ESO, comes into play. And strong proponent for me, you see how my approach is that maybe your spontaneous dynamics of the resting state, the spatial temporal structure, is carried over to the task states / to cognition. So I consider emotion, cognition, perception, motor in spatial temporal terms. Yeah? So we analyze time series now on the affective level. We just have a paper impressed on the thought dynamics. Even the change in thought, we investigate with these measures because we say maybe that corresponds to the change in the dynamics of your brain. So rather than focusing on specific thought content, I focus on the thought dynamics. And this is what I mean by spatial temporal neuroscience here as a bridge between brain dynamics and brain functions. And with that, I close. So I think that the self is also an elusive notion, but I think it can reveal a lot of the secrets also of the brain, force me to completely reverse my model of the brain. And I think it can also gives us a lot of insight about brain-mind connection. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, George. A fascinating talk. And if we have a chance at the end, I will come back to my comment that it may not be an either or between the high level and the basic. And in fact, your recent review of self-consciousness is very much moving in this direction. But let's keep this at the end if we have time. If not, we'll follow up separately. Laurence, as co-chair, a quick question, and then we will get to the panel.
Okay, well, I mean, you know, as you said, Laurette, this is an incredibly rich presentation, and the problem is selecting one question or among the 20 or 30 that I've accumulated as you've been going along. So let me just ask you then one general question about the focus on temporal dynamics. And in a way, it captures a little bit of what Laurette was alluding to and so on, because the temporal dynamics you're talking about are those that make sense in terms of the intrinsic activity of the brain. They're mostly less than 1 second, except for your sort of infra-slow process. And the question is really, to what extent do you think that those temporal synchronies are part of bringing together different regions of the brain, different circuits and so on, so that they can all additively in some ways add up to the selection of a particular action, let's say, or you know, something becomes in the foreground. And to what extent are those simply the kind of carrier wave for the modulation that is really the content of our experience? That is, there's a lot of other stuff going on that is about what we're perceiving in the world, about you know, the kinds of information that we need. And where that leads for me is both trying to understand again the relationship between the very general process and its function and the more specific contentful, if you will, things that are going on, but it also extends then to other time scales and to time scales that maybe are time scales that are associated with interpersonal dynamics, with social contexts and so on. And you kind of hint toward that when you start doing this contrast between internal and external decision-making, which obviously is configured in very different ways in different social worlds. So anyway, I'm not sure if that's a question or that's already 5 of the 30 questions, but anyway. Yeah, I'll stop.
George, a quick answer to this, and then we will be starting with Lisa as the first on the panel. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks. 2 good questions as I thought it. So time scales, of course, we operate in fMRI 100 seconds to 10 seconds EEG faster. And of course, if it's really scale free, the same principle should be applied to even longer time scales, which I would love to do because that's what I need, for instance, in order to get fluctuations of self in bipolar, which patients often report over months. How to do that inference, I cannot scan them for 1 year, obviously. I don't know, and we are working on that. But if it's scale free, I should be able to make the inference, yeah, if it's properly scale free. So it's a crucial thing. I agree completely, and we need to improve on that. Second point, very interesting, I agree completely. 10 years ago, I thought time and space are on equal footings. Now I no longer think, because it is clear that slow frequencies are by default more spatially extended than faster frequencies. Look at the C side. Same here. So you see the slow frequencies are probably have a longer impact, more functional connectivity with other regions than faster frequency regions. Yeah. So we have just a paper accepted in Nature Communication Biology about temporal spatial topography. Exactly that, how time projects into space. And of course, I'm eager and I'm working on that because it's very difficult also bringing in the spatial side into the subjective consciousness side. So how your time perception experience, and there's wonderful models of subjective time perception by Vogel et al. 2018 and Tönnes Stöcker 2019, how that is on space experience. Because obviously I assume that the temporal spatial topography of your brain sort of translates into corresponding temporal spatial experience also on the subjective level. We did something with peripersonal space, a paper on that, things like that, yeah.
Thank you, George. Lisa, why don't you go ahead? And the next one will be Paul for a content follow-up, but I also know that Paul has to teach at 1 o'clock, so I want to make sure that he can comment while he is still relaxed. Go ahead, Lisa. You introduce yourself and the comment as you find appropriate.
Sure. I'm Lisa Feldman-Barrett, a university distinguished professor at Northeastern University, and I have appointments at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. So I just want to start by thanking Georg for a really expansive talk. And I'll just quickly thank Lawrence and Laurette for inviting me to offer comments today. I have to say that for me, a really wonderful talk is a talk where I am listening and I'm also associating to many, many things. And that was how I couldn't really write fast enough, frankly. So I hope this is I'm glad it's being audio taped. And I was thinking about, projecting forward, thinking about the wonderful conversations I'm going to have with my lab when I ask them to watch this talk. It was just really spectacular, honestly. I think there are a number of comments to offer. I could approach this from a predictive coding standpoint. I could predict this. I talk about this from the standpoint of time and space integration in the brain, and what is the brain actually doing and how do we understand mapping. But what I've decided to do is really take an evolutionary developmental approach, which is the Evo-Devo approach, just to highlight a couple of things. So I really resonate to Georg's point about the self as an active construction, particularly in cortical midline structures in the default mode network. And I would actually also include the salience network, because when you look at limbic circuitry, my gentle adjustment maybe would be to say there is no limbic system in the brain, but there are limbic structures, and they're really distributed across several networks, and they also are, several of them are rich club hubs, which perform the function that Lawrence mentioned. And about integrating across vast distances across the brain. So here's what I would say. From an evolutionary standpoint and an ecological standpoint, brains didn't evolve to think. They didn't evolve to feel. They didn't evolve to see even. They evolved to control the body. I mean, I understand that's a teleological point, and we all try to avoid teleology, but basically, your brain's most important job is regulating the internal systems of your body, and everything else it does in the service of that. So I think that's the first point that I want to make. And the second point that I want to, or a related point that I want to make, is that the midline structures that Georg is referring to related to the self are key structures in the regulation of the autonomic nervous system, the immune system, the endocrine system, and so on and so forth. And that what we call spontaneous activity is activity where the brain is not being probed by the external world, but your brain is always attached to your body, and your body is always sending information back to your brain. You're not aware of it because we're not wired to be aware of it directly, but that's always happening even in resting state. And so I think it's important to realize that there is probably a very basic relationship between a sense of self and basic physical regulation of the body, which I think some scientists and philosophers know, because they link, the first moments of self in an infant to the infant's ability to connect a sense of agency, connect movement in their body and what's going on internally in their body to some impact on the external world. I think it's also important to mention that, an infant brain is not a miniature adult brain. It's a brain that is waiting for wiring instructions. And those wiring instructions come from the infant's own body and from the world around the infant. So we have the kind of brains, we have the kind of nature that requires nurture. We have the kind of brains that require statistical regularities from the world and from the body in order to wire the brain with an internal model. And I think spontaneous activity basically is that internal model. Now, if I had longer time to talk to you, I would also explain how the regions of the brain that Georg is referring to are also, for people who study affect, they refer to those as affective regions. For people who study value and reward, they call them reward and affective regions. For people who study attention, they call them attention regions. And in fact, those regions of the cortex actually project to the bed nuclei that regulate the neuromodulators that control attention. I would also say that if we had more time, I could actually give you a hypothesis for how the brain is performing this constructive process and link that literature to memory and also to concepts, to conceptual processing, all of which also refer to those parts of the brain, right? So those parts of the brain are also referred to as a memory system. They're referred to as a conceptual system. So my bottom line is this, that I think we really have to move past the idea that memory, the self, concepts, affect, regulation of the body, that these are all separate things that are influencing one another in a mechanistic way. And instead we have to think of them as mental events with mental features that arise from an integrative system with a common computational framework, that everything is an active construction, really, in the moment, across some temporal scale. And I think that Georg's work really speaks to that common computational framework, I guess. It doesn't answer everything, but it sets up a really nice framework for asking those kinds of questions, which means it's potentially, when combined with other work that's pushing in that direction, including my own, potentially paradigm changing. And I think that includes some of the people who will speak next. And so I'll stop there.
Very interesting. Georg, you go ahead, a quick comment.
I make a very nice, excellent comment. I make a very quick, first, I agree completely. It's not just midline salience. We have a lot of insular stuff in our findings, which I didn't emphasize. Even the 2011 had insular. Insular, we often co-activates with the midline stuff, often thalamus, subcortical regions. So all the regions, what you subsume under silence, complete agreement. Yeah, the self has no anatomical boundaries. Second point, primacy of the body in the evolution of the brain, yes and no. I would rather say it's a co-evolution of the brain with body and environment. I don't think it's a primacy of the body. What the brain gives is consistency. Of course, that's a speculation, persistent structure. Yeah. And I try to indicate some of these structure. And the brain needs to keep that structure consistent across all the perturbation it continuously gets. Now, when I do this, your brain gets a lot of visual perturbation. It needs to stay stable. The body provides a more stable perturbation, but still is a perturbation. And the brain tries to align that by phase synchronization and so on. So I would probably speak of a co-evolution of body environment for the brain, which it tries to provide stability, persistent, but of course that's speculation. Third point, I very much like that remark. And the way I understand the self, and that's my basis model of self-specificity, that's exactly this basic feature. So I would say that your mind wandering, your memory, your affect have a certain degree of subjectivity. They have an experience, they have a perception to it. That comes from an underlying, most basic computational process, what I call self-related processing. So your interoceptive, exoceptive input must be processed by your spontaneous activity, which is shaped by the environmental life event. So you have no chance of avoiding that. And I agree completely, yeah.
Can I just make one correction? Maybe I wasn't clear, so I apologize for that. What I was saying was that the brain is running an internal model of its body in the world. So I completely agree with you. And I would also say that if you actually do the analysis slightly differently, you can see that default mode and salience networks overlap in several rich club hubs, including the insula, actually the entirety of the insula. So again, you know, but I just wanted to clarify that I wasn't really prioritizing the body. I was emphasizing it because everyone else seems to forget that their brains are attached to their body. That's all.
Well, I think.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's very much along your line of work. So a short commentary.
Yeah. So thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. And I got to say, I had a great question prepared when I read your paper that you sent, Georg, but then you gave away you said the answer, so now I don't have that question. So then I came up with another one, but then Lisa Feldman-Barrett took that one. So I'm glad I'm second, because I can't think of too many of these things.
Kiran, you will be next after. Go ahead.
So my original question had to do with self in other animals and how you would conceive of that. And I can see that you have, and I'm going to take a look at your paper with Panksepp and from 2016. So maybe what I could just do is sort of follow along with what Lisa had just been saying in terms of the sort of fundamental interoceptive sense of self and how that may have been extended in evolution to more complex behavior towards a human situation. And there, what I would, you know, again, I'm coming it up on the spot because all my prepared questions are gone. But one thing I would mention is there's a very, I think, strong fundamental model of brain topology by Luis Puelles, which is based essentially on development. And in it, the nervous system, and this applies to all vertebrates, in it, there's a series of segments. The first of which is what he calls the terminal hypothalamus, and that's primarily involved in interoception and hormonal control of the body. So this is all very much internally generated states and internal regulation. The second segment is the peduncular hypothalamus. And then beyond that are structures like the midbrain and spinal cord. And what I think is particularly striking about that model is that peduncular hypothalamus has a bulge that comes out of it during development. And that bulge becomes the entire forebrain, including the cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, amygdala, hippocampus, most of the structures that are so highly developed in humans. And that part of the hypothalamus, I would say, and Puelles and others would say, is related to regulation outside of the body, dealing with the outside world, through sensory motor control, predictive coding, etc. And it seems to me quite interesting in respect to these different levels of self. There's sort of this core self, which every animal has. It's how well you're doing with meeting your internal needs through internal control. And that is fundamental, but it has not, and it's always present in all animals, but it hasn't really changed so much because those are fairly stable needs and biochemical processes. But this second part exploded so dramatically, in part because the problem of meeting your needs through interaction with the world is kind of an infinitely expanding problem domain. The world is continuously becoming more sophisticated, et cetera. And so there's a sense in which there's this kind of layering of different types of regulatory control that are associated with different sort of segments, fundamental developmental pieces of the nervous system. And so there is a sort of an expansion of control further into the world. And that's perhaps some kind of a process where you start to distinguish yourself from the outside world, because the way you deal with internal stuff and external stuff is going to be very different. But then there's another layering of self, and you know more about this than I do. It comes into the social domain, where now you have to separate your own goals, et cetera, from those of other conspecifics that you want to cooperate and compete with, et cetera, and so on and so on. And it seems to me that one could sort of construct a sort of a layered architecture of different selves going on to, you know, a very self-reflective, you know, sort of that maybe only in humans, which actually, you know, you sort of examine yourself internally, et cetera, et cetera. And anyway, I'm guessing a lot of this is in that paper that I'm going to read from you, but I would like to just essentially invite you to maybe comment a little bit about this idea of layering different aspects of the self in this type of expansion of control further into the complexities of the world.
Thank you, Paul. Short comment, no, before
short comment. Let me just, because you really hit. So this is another paper which we just published this year. Here we did a meta-analysis of another. And what we did, I just tell you very quickly, just move down here, you can see. So exactly we had different interoceptive processes, exoceptive process, mental self-processing, representing. And we did corresponding studies, meta-analysis, fMRI studies, purely interoceptive, all kind of interoceptive processing, not only heart, also stomach, urogenital tract, exoceptive paradigms, and more mental self-reflective paradigms, the typical self-referential paradigm. So we sorted different paradigms according to these criteria. And I just walk you, I don't want to walk you through all the figures. I just scroll down. This may be an interesting thing here, what we could see here. So this is purely interoceptive processing. This is basically heartbeat awareness and studies like this, where no self-question was asked. On the body, you see, of course, silence network, insular, thalamus, typical regions, exactly the regions Lisa was just mentioning. Then more exoceptive paradigms where you had to observe yourself, self-face recognition. Here, again, the insular and then some higher order regions. And when you had the typical self-referential, I have to become aware that it is myself, the typical self-referential trait, adjective, personality paradigms, you see all this midline stuff. So then we looked where these different regions overlap, these different levels overlap. And this is basically what it comes down to yet. So all three paradigms involve the insula. Yeah. Then the exocept, insular, and some other regions, and then here mental, again insular. So that's exactly the kind of layer and nestedness which you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So when you mention that, it really fits. It's very interesting. On a phenomenal level, I would probably say this is an increasing temporal spatial expansion of yourself. Meaning here, you have a very limited time and space scales. You're just restricted to your body experientially. Here, you're a little bit more outside, proprioception of your body comes in. And here you really also will see other exactly the kind of things what you mentioned.
Thank you very much. Shifting to you, Kiran, you introduce yourself, and I'm most intrigued to hear what you will comment upon both the presentation, but also Lisa's comment that the child brain is a brain waiting to be wired. So Kiran, and then it will be Marina, who comes at all those layers from a straight psychology perspective. Go ahead, Kiran.
Well, thank you very much, Laurette, for inviting me to be part of the panel. I'm Kieran O'Donnell. I'm an assistant professor at the Yale Child Study Center in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology and Reproductive Sciences at Yale University, and an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill. I'm keeping that affiliation for as long as I can. Georg, thank you so much for a great presentation, incredibly thought-provoking, and I'm operating outside of my comfort zone. So I guess, as Lisa mentioned, when you're in that space, you're trying to create those connections, you're trying to draw links with your own expertise and your own research interests. And, you know, one thing that I think immediately comes to mind is this idea of genomic priming. So I do a lot of work in in epigenetics. And there's this notion that different exposures can set up the genome, can set up the epigenome so that it is poised to better respond to subsequent exposures. And so when I was looking at those individual differences in your power log exponent, I was wondering to what extent do those individual differences map on with flexibility in terms of major life transitions to incorporate different identities or to establish different identities within your sense of self? And do you think it's the same slow wave activity that is responsible for incorporating that new sense of identity into the sense of self? Because what we find in epigenetics is that there are some sites that are responsible for baseline activity, and then there are some sites that actually are responsible for the capacity to respond to an exposure. So do you think that there are maybe faster waves, higher frequency waves that are responsible for that flexibility? Or I'd just be interested in your comments on that. In terms of Lisa's comments, just again blowing my mind. You know, I can think of a paper, you know, the developmental origins of the psychological baseline. To what extent and to when does the baseline become established? What are the salient experiences and exposures that set that baseline and set those individual differences? And I thought your comments on child maltreatment were very interesting, but I'd be very interested in a time series. Elizabeth Binder and Christine Heim are doing some fantastic work in Berlin, where they're bringing children in very soon after a notice of child maltreatment, and they're imaging those children, and they're collecting longitudinal biosamples so they can identify the biological embedding of that experience. And I was just wondering, at what time scale do you think that those changes in the baseline would be evident? And you know, what role do longitudinal studies have in this work?
Go ahead, Georg. Quick reply for each of you, Lisa also. Go ahead.
Very good comment. Of course, you see these inter-individual differences. However, intra-individually, the PLE seems to be relatively stable. It doesn't change so much during task. So that means it provides an intra-individual measure of stability. We compared it with other oscillatory measures, meaning the structure remains the same, but there are some shifts between fast and slow, which makes you adaptive. But the overall structure, that's why the power law exponent correlates with the self and not the single power. Yeah, so structure versus, let's say, neuronal content specific is key here. So the fast, slow, it's probably the relationship between that is basically the relationship between stability, adaptivity. The concept of baseline I really liked. And I'm working on it. You know, the concept of baseline was originally into neuroscience, strongly introduced by Marcus Reckley with the default mode. He considered it as a physiological baseline. Then we wrote it a psychological baseline, but then that idea was forgotten and it turned into the default mode network. However, and we're just about working on a paper where we say maybe the spontaneous activity, what is the function and role of the spontaneous activity, which is unclear. Maybe it's to provide a baseline. And the baseline must be both. It must be stable, persistent over time, PLE, but it must also be adaptive over long-term changes in the context, cultural malleability, traumatic life events. Yeah, so that's, I think, completely new territory. And usually people don't think in terms of those baselines, at least often not in functional imaging. Baseline is just used as a contrast. Yeah.
Thank you,
Not really as a
Lisa,
baseline.
you want a short comment? Yeah, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I completely agree, actually. So I think there is really some really nice evidence from Catherine Talan-Badri's work. I think I said her name correctly, which shows really clearly that that resting state activity, spontaneous activity, really is yoked to the body. And again, I'm not emphasizing the body over the world. The brain is running an internal model of its body in the world. And that internal model basically is the basis. We could call them perceptual inferences. We could call them motor inferences. We could call them, you know, prediction signals. We can call it memory. You can call it it's called, that's how you know something's important in psychology, is like it has lots of different names by different labs. But I completely agree with you. It is, essentially, it is like a physiological baseline, but I would also say that it's, as you've shown, it's associated with mental features that you can think of as being a psychological starting point, I guess, yeah.
Thank you. Marina, your work on mindfulness of various goal achievement is so relevant for this mental vis-a-vis body. Go ahead, Marina. You identify yourself after having unmuted. Okay.
Thank you, Laurette, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Marina Milyevskaya. I'm Associate Professor at Carleton University in psychology, and I conduct research on motivation and self-regulation. And thank you, Georg, for a fascinating talk. I wanted to follow up on Paul's comment and something touched on Kieran's question, is this idea, rather than considering different levels of the self vertically, so you know, different kind of levels like this, I was curious about different selves more horizontally. So some ways similar to Kieran's question about different selves, I guess, across different domains. So there's research suggesting that people think of themselves differently. They have different self-concepts across different domains in their lives. We know that people have very different experience and set different goals in different domains. And so I was wondering about how that fits with your idea of the self. And for example, in the study you presented, looking at consistency, where consistency is linked to the time scale there. I wondered if consistency differs because some people just have more differentiated sense of self. And so for those people whose selves are more differentiated across domains, what that would mean, or the implications of that for what you're finding in the brain. So that's kind of my first question that I was interested in.
George, oh, sorry, do you have another question before we shift to George? Yeah.
I did, sure, yeah. So the second one was related about what your research suggests, if your research suggests that some people are better at incorporating their self into decision-making than others. So if some people are more likely to draw on these self-preferences, this kind of intrinsic interest than other people, and how that would relate to self-control. So does the resting state that you're measuring relate to things like trait self-control or self-control success? So I guess the broader question in the context of this multidisciplinary convergence is, what are your implications of this research for understanding in the moment decision-making? Or how do you integrate the different selves or preferences that people might have to make in the moment decisions?
Excellent question, Marina. Just as George answered, just to announce that as we are in decision-making, Colin, you're next. Go ahead, George.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I think your question, different selves. Yes, I would ask a different concept of self, different time scales along this nested hierarchy, what I showed in the previous data, but of course that needs to be fleshed out. And yourself operates in different time and space scales, and that we associate that with different concepts of self. It's the self-similarity of the self, scale-free self-similarity of the self. That's what a scale-free activity is about. Yeah. So second, the control in the decision-making. So my idea would be that the spatial temporal dynamics of your spontaneous activity affect is intrinsically present in different ways, slightly different ways in the different regions, meaning that the different regions / different networks with a distinct spatial temporal dynamic can add different contributions to the overall mental life in exactly the way Lisa sketched it. And that what we then say, okay, look, that we call this affect, we call this cognition, we call this like that. So my idea would be that different cognitive functions, different affects, even different emotions may be specified by slightly distinct spatial temporal patterns. That's what I mean by spatial temporal neuroscience. And that there's no principal difference between episodic and working memory, but both just work on different time scales. And that means there's no principal difference between them. Cognitively, yes, the contents, but dynamically, it's the same principle. That's what I mean by structure. And that, of course, strongly affects yourself. Last comment, your moment decision-making. I would say that ideally, that's what I do with my time series. Your present moment decision-making should be somewhat the probability of which predicted by the longer time scales, not just, let's say, your decision-making at T3 should, by let's say T6, should not only be predicted by T5, your predictive input, like predictive coding. No, it should also be somewhat predicted by T1. And that could be 1 month ago, let's say, if you have the time scales. Yeah, that's your predisposition, that's your capacity. Because that's what I see in psychiatry patients. When they have they have to immediately make a decision moment, that's where their unstable dynamic systems becomes manifest. Yeah, that's where the psychological fragility becomes manifest. When they have certain unexpected life events where they cannot cope with, where they don't have the dynamic stability in the system. That's, of course, speculation. But I think that relates to that.
Thank you, George. Very interesting. And I'm intrigued to hear what Colin will be building upon this, because decision-making and self-control is very much what neuroeconomics has been focusing on for the last 15 years. Colin, go ahead.
Yep. Thanks. I'm Colin Kammerer from Caltech, and I've been interested in behavioral economics, which is kind of importing ideas and methods from psychology and then later neuroscience to think about economics and really make better predictions. And so one concept that I think this is absolutely fantastic. I learned so much, by the way, and like the learning per minute was off the scale, George. So there's an old idea probably in philosophy, and Jan Elster has written a lot about this, and about what's called the multiple self model and how that's relevant for self-control. And I'll tell you just a little bit of history and ask you, I hope, a very pointed question, which is, one of the first uses of this in economic theory was in the 60s by Phelps and Pollock. And they were actually interested in bequests, which is how do you explain people leaving money for their kids and their grandkids are not leaving money, and how do they divide the money? And so they introduced a model in which you discount future utility, but there's another discount rate for your kids' utility, your children's utility. So instead of a discount factor, there's an extra parameter they happen to call beta. David Lapson, 40 years later, came along and said, 30 years later, came along and said, maybe we can think of that beta as the current self's weight on the utility of the future self. So the parent is to the child as me right now is to me next week. And that led to what's called a multiple self model. Again, that wasn't the first person to think about this kind of neo-Freudian, I contain multitudes. And the other thing that's important about that is that David and others were then able to use game theory, which was designed to explain interactions among different people or different nations or different genes, to think of this kind of intrapersonal game with my future self. And that leads to Ulysses and the Sirens and all these things. Is there evidence from the way you've been thinking about the self that's either pro or con this idea that my current decision-making involves a conception of a future self, and maybe want to constrain the future self, right? Like signing up to give a talk to force me to do the research, or, having a gym buddy. There's a bunch of these kind of like soft and hard commitments where it's like the parent is committing the child. Is it, seem to thought of everything. So I hope you have something interesting, and I bet you do, to say about this.
Before George answers, just Jorge, you will be the next one, will remain in the brain, and then going back to the practice with Don, and keeping the computational framework for the end with Friederike. Go ahead, George.
Okay, yeah, actually. First, the utility. Of course, that depends upon the context. And the context seems to shape your topography of the brain, your temporal topography or spatial topography in a long-term way. Yeah. So there is some meaning that what your context, let's say, if you're 20 years exposed to a very fast context, I'm sure that your visual cortex and its topography to the other region will adapt. So meaning you will find fast reaction as of high utility and slow reaction of low utility. Now, if you're in India and in an ashram and do meditation for 20 years, I'm sure that will be different. Yeah. So meaning that's the adaptive, probably plastic nature of yourself, but it's a long term, it's not immediate. Yeah. So there is a stability and adaptivity, but again, they operate on slightly different time scales. Yeah. And I think that's very tricky, that relation. The second point, the extension into the future. I always see, for me, because when I look at this power law exponent or the autocorrelation window, it is described as a long-range temporal correlation. So you calculate the autocorrelation window by correlating T1, neural activity at T1 with T2, T3, T4, T5, T blah, 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 and then T2 is the same with all other time points. Meaning there is an implicit stretching of time, a virtual extension of time. Yeah, so, and that's what I would associate, and I think maybe he's even online, one of my postdocs in Italy, Andrea Scalabrini, who did the animate-inanimate study. He's investigating now mental time travel episodic simulation. And we link that. But episodic simulation now, not in a cognitive way, where I imagine the future. No, it's already dynamically predisposed by the temporal structure of my brain. Yeah, so it's a dynamic mental time travel, which is the underpinning of the cognitive.
Thank you very much.
Great, that's fascinating.
Georg?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jorge Harmony from Psychiatry and Psychology at McGill, mainly interested in affective neuroscience and things like that. So first is wow, I mean, it's still trying to wrap my head around all this, and myself feels very, very small right now. And a bit as Paul was mentioning, you know, any sort of mildly interesting question has been already sort of addressed. So maybe what I'll do is I'll rephrase or reformulate some of them, and sort of what I'm interested in context, and context in the general sense, spatial temporal context. And so you talked, or you emphasized a lot, and there's been a lot of talk about the spatial temporal dynamics of these processes, both at the sort of scale of milliseconds or seconds or whatever, you know, in the actual process of decision making, and so forth, and then these long-term changes, such as the influence of childhood trauma on the self. And so my question, or my interest, is in between. So is there anything interesting in a sort of more in a temporal scale that's sort of similar? I'm not sure how to put it. Can we change the self based on the context? And so I'm thinking, sort of to put it in a sense, like, is there a trait version of the self and a state version of the self that is the self you said is very stable, but also it's malleable? So can context change the self, or is sort of the whole point of the self is to be again sort of somewhat stable in the encounter of changes, everyday changes, or contextual aspects of it. So that's sort of my questions to when we talk about self, and that leads to, you know, sort of similar to when we talk about emotion regulation, emotion control. Is there a control of the self, which is not the same as self-control? So is there a point in controlling and modulating ourselves, and how can we do that, and how do we do that, and why would we do that? That's sort of my question.
Yeah. Shall I answer?
Yeah, a quick answer. We have, let's say we can run over maybe no more than 10 minutes. We are at 12:55 now, and we still have 2 comments. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I make it short. So yes, I think plasticity of self, context dependent. Of course, yes. And the tricky thing in the self, you need to combine plasticity, change, plus stability. And that's relative. So for instance, one paradoxon, you have continuous dynamics, continuous change, but there's a certain structure in that change. So that gives you stability. So meaning change and stability are not opposing features, but are probably mediated by one and the same dynamical features. And it's relative on different time scales. One time scale might be more adaptive, another one not. Maybe in psychotic disorders, you have a certain time scale where extremely responsive and adaptive, which makes and destabilizes the other ones. We don't know. Yeah, so it's a multi-layered time scale with partial independence of the different temporal layers. Control of self. My idea would be the more you abstract single time points from the contextual, from the other time points, the more you have the feeling of control. So what for me cognition is an abstraction. So you have in the mind wandering, Christoph and I pointed very out nicely, you have deliberative constraints on your thoughts. And that is contrasted with automatic thought processing. And what she calls automatic, of course, I would call dynamic, where you have absolutely no control. But however, if you abstract T2 from T1 and T3 and disregard their relation, then you might have the chance of having a control over it, and that what you probably would call then emotion regulation or control, for instance.
Very interesting. Shifting to Don, who like Colin and me, maybe for the last for almost 30 years, we were in the behavioral space, and Don is the one that has been integrating this on an everyday basis into his medical practice. So Don, your comment, please.
Yeah, thanks for that, Laurette. I'm Don Rettelmeyer, a professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. My favorite part was your idea about the construction of self and how it's not entirely a function of rationality, but instead is a function of biology, that there may certainly be a crosstalk between internal forces and external perceptions. And the question is, how strong is that? I'm often struck by, if I give my patient an antibiotic, they feel so much better the next day, but it's not that antibiotics are so effective, it's that they're no longer in that nasty, pleasant, noisy emergency department anymore. Or another patient who may be complaining bitterly about the quality of nursing care, but it's not because they've got a bad nurse, it's that they've got a bad pelvic fracture, i.e. how our internal states can interfere with our perceptions and even our self-identity.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very big effect.
Very nice question. Of course, I completely agree. As a psychiatrist, you can have the same medication. If you have a positive or negative attitude, it will have different effects. So that's what I mean by self-specificity, intrinsic subjectivity. And these clinical observations drive all my neuroscience. That's what I see as even the most acute patient, psychotic patient who needs to be treated and police is around and crazy. The delusions, they have a subjective meaning. They are try to get a grip on the external perception. And the internal, external, I told you, there's a lower level interoexoceptive integration. And we haven't worked, I have no idea what's going on there. Of course, I assume that the cycle durations are key for interoexoceptive integration. How that works, we have a whole line of interoceptive awareness research in depression, which I didn't show. Yes, of course. The self is transmodal, it's transsensory, because it is always an unconscious, completely automatic integration of interoexoceptive stimuli. You see abnormal shift, anxiety patients. I have the feeling I die, panic, yeah, completely crazy perception. So there seems to be a predominance of interoceptive over exoceptive stimuli they're completely focused on. No idea how that works. It's really the deeper construction level of self. I have no idea at this point. But
Thank
clinically,
you.
That's where we come from. Yeah, I agree.
Excellent. Frederick, you are the last one, but you may have the most challenging mandate beyond reacting to George as you find appropriate. I was most intrigued by Lisa's comment on the brain, the body, and in fact, society being all part of a common computational framework. And I know that your work is very much on this computational neuroscience. So go ahead, Friederike, as you find appropriate.
Yes, thank you for having me here. I'm Friederike Petschner. I'm an assistant professor at Brown University and a senior research fellow at the ETH Zurich. As you just said, my work focuses mainly on computational modeling in the context of psychiatry in particular. So the area I work in is computational psychiatry. And I first want to thank you, Georg, for a very, very rich talk. I had a lot of comments. Now, in the interest of time, I think I restricted to one or maybe two, depends on how much time we have left. But before I kind of get into my question, I just want to say that I really found it very intriguing to link time and space to self-perception. And I used to work on time perception back in the day. Yeah. And I recently started again in the context of psychiatry. So this motivates me to continue that line of work for sure. And the question I have is a slightly different, but it relates to many of the comments that have been posed earlier, which is this key question of how does our brain distinguish between kind of a self-generated and an externally generated sensory input. So how do we distinguish between the inner and the outer? And there's an intriguing example from vision, where when I move my head, obviously the world is moving in front of my eyes. So if I move my eyes, there is a movement that comes from kind of the fact that I move myself, but it could also be that I'm in an environment where the world is moving. And so how do I distinguish between these equally sensory inputs? In one scenario, it is me generating the movement. In the other one, it's the world moving. And so back very early on, Hermann von Helmholtz has proposed, and then actually later on, Erich von Holst have worked on this and suggested that what we need to know is whether we generated the movement or not. And so what we have is a signal, which is called the efference copy, that tells us that this movement was generated by ourselves, and it's kind of sent back upwards in the hierarchy. And the funny thing is this signal has been found. So we do know that we have an efference copy, at least of visual signals and motor signals. But what that means then is that by having a signal of our motor command, we need to be able to translate this into representing how that would change our sensory inputs. So we need a predictive model of the world based on knowing what our motor movements do to our sensory inputs. And we need an efference copy. And those two things kind of are essential in order to differentiate between inner and outer world, or self and other. And so my key question would then be, do you think that these are the two crucial components for having a sense of self, an efference copy and an internally predictive model? Or if we put it a little bit differently, if the brain could distinguish between self and external generated inputs, would there still be a sense of self?
Yeah, yes, thank you very much for the question, and also thank you for your email with this question. I appreciate it. And okay, let me answer to that. So you said, how do they integrate these different models? So for me, self is always an integration of different stimuli into interoceptive, exoceptive when it comes down to it. It's really transmodal, across domains. But how does it work? So we had one, and you know the well-known rubber hand illusion here. And we did in the subject the rubber hand illusion, and we did a temporal simultaneity judgment. That means you present stimuli 50, 100, 200, 300, 400 milliseconds apart, and you let subject judge whether it's one or two stimuli. And when they are put 5, 50 or 100 milliseconds, they still perceive the two stimuli as one stimulus. That basically gives you a window of temporal integration. And what we observed, and you can do this unimodal, transmodal. And this is, I think, 2016 or 17 in Cognition, that paper, where we say, look, the degree of your temporal binding window, the meaning to which you integrate perceived two stimuli as simultaneous, was directly related to your degree of your rubber hand illusion, how much you're prone to the rubber hand illusion. So that means for me, you have again sort of a very temporal basis of your perception. And I would approach the kind of phenomena which you mentioned in the same way. And indeed, in the visual literature, you have a lot of literature in EEG that pre-stimulus activity, pre-stimulus temporal features predict post-stimulus visual perception. Yeah. So it would be, again, for me, a temporal mechanism of perception. That was the easy one. And of course, all these measures like autocorrelation window, I associate now we want to do relates it with phase cycles and links the phase cycles to temporal integration. So this is where computational modeling comes into place. Now the more difficult question, inner outer. That's a horribly difficult distinction, because I think conceptually it involves two levels. First, you have an objective level. You have the external world and you have an internal world. However, you have also within your inner world, within that internal, you have also an inner outer distinction, because I have external mental contents. For instance, when I do mental imaging, and I have internal mental contents, which are more to my own self rather than external self. Sensory, dreaming is a typical example of an external mental content. Mental is inner by default. So meaning the distinction of inner outer might be problematic. And I would strongly say that the self is prior to that. So for me, the self is not inner. The self is for me inner outer, and out of that we differentiate or abstract what is inner outer. So meaning if there were a brain somewhere, Zoom here, maybe some of those Zoom people is the brain, and the brain might sit there and say, smile, how stupid are all these people that they distinguish between internal and external? I don't care. Yeah, so I just need to cope, and I come back to the earlier comment, I just need to integrate all this different stimulus input they bombarded me with. And maybe what we call internal external has slightly different temporal features, and that's true. The heart is very regular, unlike the external. So maybe the brain makes a difference by the stochastics. However, that can go wrong, as we all know, in psychiatry. So the brain can be fooled, and that's exactly what we do in visual illusion. So the predictive, I agree, predictive is a key feature, but I would argue, I would like to develop a line there. It's going what Kiebel et al. 2008 in a very nice paper, and Fritz in 2017 in an NRB paper called the deep temporal models. And I think that needs to be enriched. And that's why I would bring in my stuff and say, your predictive coding in the pre-stimulus interval might be a reflection of an underlying dynamic, variability changes. Yeah, change in PLE suddenly. So you need, that's why we always investigate the pre-stimulus period and non-additive interaction with the external stimulus.
Thank you.
Answers some questions.
Thank you so much, George, and thanks to all of you. It has been a fascinating and so enriching 2 hours. Normally, we end this by a 30 seconds comments from each of you. What is it that, if you are to provide insights on how we should be going with this precision convergence science, what would you bring now? I will ask the same 30 seconds, but within the context of Nathan Sprang and I had funding for an in-person meeting that was supposed to happen in June on the multidimensional self and the neuroscience of this multidimensional self and the integration into real-world practice. So instead of this one day, we will have a special series on the self in the second and third week of January, where we will zoom on different domains, finance, clinical, eating, and so on. So I would like to ask you this quick roundtable, and we will end by Laurence and George, on what is the key next step that you would see if we are to delve further into this self that is a key bridge between the brain, the body, and the world. Let's start, and some of the panel had to leave, so I will start with you, Marina, and then Kiran, I think he's still there.
Laurette, this is Kitty. There's two questions in the chat room. I don't know if we'll have time to get to them.
Yeah, no, I think we will get them addressed after the fact. in email because we do need to close by 1 p.m.
Very good.
So Marina, Don, Jorge, and Colin, and Kiran, if you're still there, and then Friederike.
Sure. So I think for me, the next step would be taking these ideas, this research out of the lab and out of the scanner and looking at how it relates to real world behavior. So really measuring people kind of in the moment, maybe using some experience sampling methodology or some other methodology that gets at people's in the moment experiences as they go about their day-to-day lives, rather than the more artificial, I guess, settings of the lab.
Thank you. Don.
Yeah, I'd recommend more studies on about pitfalls in sensing the self, how they might lead to fallible medical decision-making.
Okay, Jorge.
I think I second Marina's point. I think that would be interesting to see the self in relation to the world. So not just the self by itself, but as you said, the self is part of the self interacting with the world, and particularly in a more sort of realistic and day-to-day and situation fashion. That would be very interesting to follow.
Thank you. Colin, are you still there? I think he may have had to leave. And I think Kiran has left also. Back to you, Friederike, then, and then Lawrence and George.
I think for me, it would be the idea of trying to integrate these different areas and levels that we have been talking about, for instance, in a computational framework, and then try to come up with quantitative predictions rather than qualitative descriptions.
Yeah, very good. Lawrence and George, you will have the closing words.
Great. So thank you very much. So, I mean, many people have pointed toward ways in which this whole approach can be extended to deal with real world scenarios in some ways. And I think part of the idea is recognizing that the self, as you're describing it, is a kind of Markov blanket, that there's a demarcation of inside and outside that is what defines the self in the first place. And even though you say, you don't want to make that distinction, you immediately fall into locutions that talk about what is representing the world or what is engaged with the world. And for me, what's important about that is that in real life, in actuality, that boundary is not always the boundary of the skin. It can be a boundary that includes objects, the environment. It commonly is a boundary that includes other people in some ways. And so I think you can start modeling that. And that's kind of what we did in our Brain and Behavioral Sciences article on thinking through other minds, to argue that that's actually the environment that human beings have been evolving in for the last 50 to 150,000 years. That is to say, it's a social world that we ourselves construct. And that's what the brain is doing, not just regulating the inner world, it's regulating the social world as well, because that's what we need to do to survive. Anyway, I think all of your work lends itself beautifully to starting to take that on board and sort of modeling the social and the spatial dimensions in that way, but not in an abstract sense, but as populated with other people and with social structure. So I'd love to see that.
George?
Oh, do we lose George?
Did we lose George?
Yeah, looks like we lost.
He was there just 30 seconds ago.
Yeah.
George doesn't look like he's on the webinar anymore.
Okay, so then I think we will end the webinar here with the understanding that, as I said, it's an au revoir until mid-January, where we will be most likely coming back to many of you and delve further into this real world. And I think, Lawrence, your comment of the boundary of the self may not just be the skin. I think it's extremely insightful in moving toward this kind of a more integrative computational framework that we have been talking about. Thanks, everybody.
George has just come back. So,
George, are you back?
Sorry, my internet was slightly
Okay. You have the closing word, dear.
Okay, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the great comment. I make it very short. I think I I agree completely with the computational side of things, which Federica brought up. I agree that also goes in the direction of Lisa to combine these different functions, see common principles. I do think that real life application is for therapy. So I'm trying now also to link some of my temporal spatial stuff. For instance, depressed patients are too slow, maybe fasten their neuronal activity, whether they get normal affect and cognition. And ultimately that can also be linked with, and then the other thing is really the plasticity, adaptivity of the spontaneous activity to the world, which with the Markov blanket internal external model, resulting as a differentiation out of a more basic fundamental process where there is not yet such an inner-outer distinction. Yeah, so I'm not opposing that, but I'm saying I want to put it on a deeper level. And I think one way could, for instance, be these deeper temporal models.
Thank you again, Georg, for excellent talks and excellent work, importantly. I think that in moving further, seeing the self as the bridge between the brain, the body, and the world, it's very, very foundational. Thanks, everybody. And we shall be back in touch for sequela to the self in January. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for the comment and the time.
Thanks so much.
Bye.